Good evening and welcome to the Joko conversation, which tonight is a conversation between me and you watching. As my partner and comrade Tasha could not be here this evening as she's handling business. And so it'll just be me, and I won't be long. Since it isn't really a conversation and a monologue. Although, feel free to drop in a comment. The I'm Brother Youssef, member of the Joko, a professor of composition, creative writing, literature, a poet, a human being on this planet, a star in this universe, a little piece of the divine. Happy to be here with you and among you other stars, little bits of the divine, walking manifestations of earth. Welcome and thank you for watching whenever you're watching this. Tonight, I want to start the way we would start if Tasha were here, though I love the way she does it, right? But always, right? We want to start, acknowledging that we work in the tradition and on the mission that has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, our personal ancestors, here in uh, occupied Turtle Island, the continental United States, their journeys from Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas to California, the roots they laid down here in California. And our African ancestors, as we always acknowledge and live, our African reality is part of a global African community, a global African nation, if you will, scattered by slave business in the early modern period, right? Beginning in the 15th century, modern period. And we also always like to acknowledge that we know we in the Joko specifically do the work we do, make the contribution we attempt to make here in this place called the Los Angeles Basin, Los Angeles, California, occupied Tongvar, the land of the Tongva Quiche people, the First Nations of this area, one of the First Nations of this area, and maybe the most widespread in this specific area, reaching into what is now called the Inland Empire and parts of Orange County. Tonight's conversation, the title, right? Slow crawl to shooting war, question mark. And that wasn't the original title, right? The first thought was slow crawl to civil war. But I think, in fact, the Civil War in the United States has been underway. And there's an argument to be made, and it has been made, that the original Civil War never really ended. And particularly with the failure to hold the Confederacy liable in any way, right? Court martials and the like, executions for treason, whatever the case may be. And subsequent to that, the as they say, the South, the Confederacy, won the peace, and is continuing to win the peace, very much through the lost cause narrative, um, that recast the Confederate cause as a cause for freedom, defense of a way of life, um, and well, how should I say, victims of an invasion, right? And there's the idea of the war, that terminology for the U.S. Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression. Now, it is my understanding that the Civil War officially began when Confederate troops or South Carolina militia um, fired on Fort Sumter. At that time, right, South Carolina, part of the United States, declares its independence and then fires on Fort Sumter. So that's that's a very twisty, right? Very twisty to reconfigure that as aggression, right? Where the aggressor becomes the aggressed. So I think we're in a civil war because just like the first Civil War, long before that that initial firing on Fort Sumter, there had been at least a decade, right, of tension, conflict. There was the history of what was called Bleeding Kansas, that involved John Brown, among others. There was the move on Harper's Ferry with John Brown and his Confederates, and we know now that out here in California, prominent member of the U.S. African community in San Francisco, Ms. Pleasant, was helping funding, was one of the funders of John Brown's exhibition. So the lead up to the beginning of the Civil War had already involved bloodshed, right? Armed struggle, and indeed the regime of slavery is always already violent, right? And founded in violence, on violence, maintained through violence, right? And the threats of violence, both interpersonal and institutional. So we've been in that situation, a slow civil war since the civil rights movement, as the Confederacy, right, the descendants of the Confederacy, those committed to segregation, really never gave up that position. I don't hear it talked about a lot, recently, and particularly as there's a lot of proper discussion. What just happened to my screen? Something weird happened. There you go. Of the history of the Democratic Party and the Dixiecrats in particular, right? And the regressiveness of the Democratic Party historically, with that shift coming in the 1930s with the New Deal, and even before, the 1930s, right? That shift is already underway in U.S. politics in the early part of the century, right? Leading up to the election of Roosevelt and the emergence or the signing of the New Deal. And with that, right, African Americans also, making that move to the Democratic Party. But we understand the history of the Democratic Party. President Johnson was very clear about what was going to happen when he signed the the Civil Rights Act, followed by the Voting Rights Act. That signing those acts, the Democratic Party was going to lose white Southerners for what, a generation plus. It's been multiple generations, right? And indeed, it's difficult to even. Well, it's difficult for me to imagine white Southerners coming back into the Democratic Party. But that's partly because of the divide that is so currently entrenched in the United States right now. So a slow walk, a slow crawl to a shooting war. Because these are deeply held beliefs. One of the most important areas of opposition to the Civil Rights Movement, to the Civil Rights Act, and a decade earlier, in the 1950s, school desegregation was the evangelical fundamentalist movement, which were opposed to school integration. So already, right, there's a religious, an article of faith about a political position. And that kind of religiosity has only deepened in the decades since. This religious commitment of the most conservative elements in the country, in some cases openly, in other cases without open acknowledgement, white nationalist movement, comfortable with various forms of authoritarianism and or fascism. This particular manifestation of capitalist colonialism or colonial capitalism, they're so intertwined with each other, because they live that authority in their church communities. And the church communities are quite intentionally like a one-stop shop, right? They make it, there's an infrastructure is created in these communities, right? It's a great model, right, for community building. But an infrastructure is created in these communities so that members don't have to go outside the community to, in many ways meet their needs, and including entertainment, right, and recreation within the church community, and so one becomes enveloped, right, in this all-encompassing community worldview, and a worldview that casts the political opposition as really irredeemable in some cases, right, or obstinate apostates, right, who just refuse to be saved, and in some cases, demonically possessed, but not a political opposition to be negotiated with, to compete with in, ordinary political contest, right, electoral contest. And there's a lot of crossover, right? What today constitutes the right wing in the United States, which again is openly white nationalist, openly colonialist, openly imperialist, right? They're feeling themselves right now. The recognizing that there are people of color, right, who are on board, um, and in some cases are welcomed in, or are useful idiots to the various right wing movements. There are different sectors of it, though, right? Um, but all of these sectors, which do overlap, are not interested in politics as usual. And that was made absolutely clear, 5 years ago, January 6, 2021, right? A story that has been officially rewritten by the current White House. And, appropriately enough, right? There was that testimony given by Jack Smith today before Congress, right? But it was made clear that day, right? The evidence was before the eyes of the world that the white nationalist, religious nationalist, Christian nationalist, right wing, well represented in the Republican Party, refuses to play by its own rules anymore, right? Or the rules set up by the system. Refuses to accept election results that don't go the way they hope. So that narrative of election fraud, right, is going to be there for every election. Again, the current presidential regime won the 2024 election and is still complaining about and lying about the 2020 election. So we're at a point in the country where politics as usual isn't going to work anymore, isn't working anymore. The and the social conditions that people are confronting only exacerbates this. The difficulty in paying for health care, the difficulty, the obscene pricing in housing, the price of food, right? The inflation that continues to go up, and the dismantling of any kind of social safety net, social programs to ameliorate the suffering that people are feeling. And of course, that suffering makes people both more susceptible to being manipulated and also more on edge and not ready to take it anymore. Now I think it's I heard I thought a very interesting commentary from an historian of U.S. political history, Dr. Joanne Freeman. I'm not sure where Dr. Joanne Freeman teaches now. I know she did teach at Yale at one point. Maybe, I don't know. I'm guessing. Maybe Columbia. I'm totally guessing because I think she's based in New York now. You can follow her if you're interested. I would be mistaken if I were to say she's a radical historian. I don't think that's the case. But she's, I think interesting and worth listening to, right? Worth hearing out, very knowledgeable. and personable. And she talks about, she just did a commentary where she's seeing this moment as um, in a sense, a post-political party moment, that neither one of the political parties in the United States is behaving like a political party, like we would expect a political party to behave. Um, the Republican Party, certainly not the Republican Party that it was 10 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And many of these Christian nationalists from these same kinds of communities I was talking about are in Congress, right, and are implementing their Christian nationalist vision. But we can see that what the Republican Party is now is less a political party, right, of capitalism, but a cult of personality. And a cult of personality, beholden is the wrong word, but intertwined with, these various elements of the U.S. right wing, reactionary right wing, that has been in reaction again since the passing of the Civil Rights Act. Well, again, got to take it further back, right? Since the passing of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigrant Reform Act of that period, the demands made and met by the women's liberation movement, and the gay liberation movement, which was the language of the time when those movements reemerged in the 1960s. And that they've been pushing back against ever since then, indeed pushing back against the New Deal ever since then. So this religious sector, you've got the sort of what do you call the sort of kind of the think tank, right wing think tank, sector. This emergent techno feudalist sector, and now really the Republican Party, its spokespersons, its surrogates in the new media landscape, leaning in to open fascism, right? Open neo-Nazism, the embrace of Nazism. So that is not the political party, certainly that it was. And the point she makes, they aren't behaving like a political party anymore, but neither is the Democratic Party, which is not acting as an opposition party to these authoritarian fascistic moves by their capitalist partners. Because we should always, recognize that, within the capitalist class, among the elites, there are battles of hegemony, right, over which sector of the elite, of the ruling class, is going to rule. And this MAGA sector, this open rule of billionaires sector, is making their move on the Democratic Party sector of the ruling class, who refuse to act like an opposition party. So are instead, at least at the leadership level, operating as like an empty shell, more interested in preserving the institutions and their particular kind of access, than actively opposing the dismantling of what structures are in place that could be exploited democratically um, in the United States, right? So this post political party moment, as Dr. Joanne Freeman sees it, um, whose specialty is looking at the 1790s, right? U.S. political history of the 1790s is her particular area, but U.S. history writ large also. The So if that's the case, right, and we see this creep to shooting war being played out in Minneapolis with actual shooting, and then I understand there have been shootings here in Los Angeles, and I can't report more than that because I just haven't gotten details about an ICE agent involved shooting, but that shooting might not have been the ICE agent shooting, as many everyday citizens in the United States who have been posting on TikTok and these other platforms, who are saying, what happened to Renee Nicole Good lets everybody know it might be time that communities begin defending themselves. And we know that is something that Black people over many generations have had to fall back on. I know it's been in the news. The Black Panther Party, a current iteration of the Black Panther Party in Philadelphia. I don't know much more about the organization and what the veterans of the original Black Panther Party think about them or whatever. But they're making that point, right? That Philadelphia has open carry, Pennsylvania has open carry laws, and they are there. They will put themselves in front of those immigrants or those citizens who are being racially profiled and asked for their papers. And other individual citizens, right, have talked about, is it time to get strapped? And that's a move that this militant right wing has been preparing for decades. I mean, absolutely for decades. Think back, if you will, to the mid-1990s, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing, right? And suddenly all the numbers of stories in the media about the various militias, right, in the country. And that was the mid-90s. And those militias had been, in place since the 70s, at least, right? Preparing for this moment. And to the best of my knowledge, and my knowledge is limited, most of these militias, their politics are right wing, right? They're nationalists, they're nativist. The irony of the settler, claiming native identity in that way. The and they're often white nationalist. They're often Christian nationalist, or in some cases, there are those neo-Nazi strains that prefer reemergent neo-paganism, right? Neo-Nordic and Germanic paganism. But you get my point. They've been preparing, and now there are people on the left who are saying, yeah, we've been preparing too. So is this a slow crawl to shooting war? As it's becoming more and more difficult for people to see a political solution to this current crisis. So I know a lot of people in the United States, even when they don't have a whole bunch of faith in the Democratic Party, and particularly as the Democratic Party seems to insist on making it as difficult as possible for its most oppositional, younger generation, more progressive, leftist, even socialist members to try to seize the reins of power from a very aging out centrist leadership. But the party's doing everything to squelch them, right? And so folks, are wondering how much stock can one put in the ability to halt any of this, even if the Democrats were to win the House in November, which they likely will, because that's just normally what happens, but possibly even the Senate. And because the current regime and the current Republican Party is so reckless and feckless, they have a good chance to actually do that, right? But even if they do, they're still the Democratic Party. How are they going to mess it up? Or will they get out of the way and let the more radical elements, and I don't even know if I should say radical elements in the Democratic Party, but I actually think there's something there, in the same way that this Republican Party has changed and just gone full fascist. This Democratic Party can change, right? It's the people in the party that will change it. So those folks who are demanding that candidates not take APAC money, maybe not take billionaire money, demand election funding reform so that there are matching funds for parties to match the billionaires. That even if they do all that, and that could somehow happen, the right wing, are they prepared to accept those election results? That's the question really before us. Let alone whether the current presidential regime is going to allow the election to go forth, and that is a question right now. Seize the ballot boxes, or, as he implied, as others have implied, as some claim they have evidence for, use the tech bros, Elon Musk, to muck up the numbers some kind of way. I mean, all of that remains to be seen. But how do we move forward? If we are dealing with people who refuse to operate, which is to say cooperate within the structures of the liberal democratic order of the electoral system, incredibly flawed in the way that has been structured, even to frustrate democratic will. But the rules that folks are playing by, that if they even refuse to play by those, what options are being left for people? So are we on a slow crawl to a shooting civil war instead of civil war exercised through culture war and legislative battle, basically, and propaganda war? How long before that's going to become shooting war? And how do you prepare? How do any of us prepare for this? Some of us come from neighborhoods where we have some familiarity with the instability, the randomness, the raw fear of of open battle, right? Of what it feels like to live in a low intensity conflict zone. Um, the kind of harassment from the police, these militarized police, the depoliticized, um, well armed gangs that can make living in a neighborhood, growing up in some of our neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods all across this nation and indeed the world, um, where people are forced basically to live in a low intensity warfare experience. The Now, if you imagine that becoming intensified and expanding to other areas of your city, your town, your region, um, and then the overwhelming, which does not mean victorious, but the overwhelming armed force that the U.S. state can bring to bear, either through its police force and certainly through its various military branches. Um, and really, you just have to imagine what it was like, living in Caracas and other parts of Venezuela just very recently. So, how are we preparing, and how do we move forward? How are we preparing for the possibilities of an open shooting war in terms of defending ourselves, taking care of ourselves, creating community that can take care of each other, mutual aid networks, preparing various community institutions for the inevitability? How do we prepare? How do we prepare ourselves medically? And how are we going to prepare ourselves emotionally for what may be coming, and what some people, and I'm talking about the right now, are making necessary and hoping to make necessary. I mean, in some ways, it's like you hate to give it to them because this is what they want, but folks are also putting communities. Again, we're seeing this played out in Minneapolis, and while it's playing out hotly in Minneapolis, the repression hasn't gone anywhere in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in various North Carolina cities, in New Orleans. It hasn't gone anywhere. What, Winston-Salem and Durham. How are we to move forward? What do we do to prepare? I'm not offering you solutions right now, but I am saying that we need to begin thinking that way and doing that thing, right? Um, uh, in all these various ways. Because the opposition continues to demonstrate that they are not willing to sit down at a table, that they are not willing to live with the rest of us. I mean, essentially, right? It's again this politic of grievance and resentment. It's like they have felt they've had to put up with us for 60 years, 60 plus years, and they're just done. They're just going full white supremacist in the tradition of their ancestors, right? And how often is Trump, he keeps evoking the late 19th century, right? The Gilded Age, the height of Jim Crow and all this, right? The establishment of this, and even the 18th century. These folks are waging a war against the 21st century, the 20th century, even the 19th century. They are waging a war against modernity and whatever advances at high cost that have been made socially, politically, in the modern era. So anyway, that's a little brief comment for tonight. Slow crawl to shooting war? Question mark. Prepare yourselves, folks, and let me take my own advice. So thank you for watching. Please do all the things that we need you to do, and we know that a few more of you have done so. So please subscribe. Do like this video, right? The liking seems to be very important to the algorithm. And share the video. And never feel, I actually didn't check to see, but never hesitate to make comments. If you have some commentary you'd like to add to the video. Right. So I'm Brother Youssef. This is the Joko Collective getting ready to sign off. We'll be back next week. I'm not sure what we're going to talk about. There's a couple of things we're trying to do more of. One thing we're trying to do more of is bring in more guests. Right. So maybe we'll have a guest next week. We'll see. And the other thing we want to do is some of the stuff we mentioned, near the a few episodes back. Look at some of the other aspects of this move toward an old style fascism that has its roots in colonialism and all of the racist, racialized, romantic ideologies of colonialism, settler colonialism, indirect colonialism, direct colonialism, neo-colonialism, post-colonialism. All right, folks, now I'm just rambling, so I'm gonna get out of here. As I like to end, I will end again. As Bob Marley says from the Natty Dread album, the song Revolution, revelation reveals the truth. It takes a revolution to make a solution. So let's make a revolution, y'all.